Welcome back to Fox Recaps. Today, I'm going to explain episodes 3 and 4 of The Good Doctor, released in 2017. The episode begins with a man getting on his motorcycle while staring at 3 ladies passing by. He revs his engine, eyes still focused on them, and rides directly into an oncoming vehicle. Dr. Sean is inside his apartment, enjoying the serenity, when a knock on his door reveals a neighbor who needs some batteries for the controller that died in the middle of her game. He does a little introduction, and Dr. Sean gets her some batteries. She thanks him and leaves. Dr. Claire receives a call at the hospital and rushes to Dr. Sean, Dr. Kalu, and Dr. Neil to announce a liver. Dr. Neil mobilizes Dr. Sean and Dr. Claire on liver pickup while Dr. Kalu prepares their patient for the transplant. Dr. Marcus is getting ready for a breast reconstructive surgery when Allegra comes in and talks to him about his 4 p.m. VIP patient, who is close to making the foundation his tax relief if he aces the operation. She wants him to make Dr. Neil his second, and he's surprised that she doubts his abilities and emphasizes perfection. On the roof, Dr. Claire asks how Dr. Sean is doing with all the noise, and he admits he likes helicopters but hasn't been on one. Dr. Claire is upset that Dr. Kalu gets to go for the surgery while they pick up, but Dr. Sean isn't listening as he visualizes how the helicopter works. Dr. Kalu questions Chuck about how he feels when Chuck calls his daughter, stating he needs to see her. Dr. Claire and Dr. Sean arrive at the other hospital and learn the liver has been out of the body cavity for over 3 hours. Dr. Sean takes the liver out of the cooler, sees there's nothing wrong, and puts it back into the cooler. Dr. Claire calls Aaron and tells him about not knowing how to talk to Dr. Sean. He tells her not to try and think about what's in Dr. Sean's mind. Instead, she should find her way in if she wants to connect with him. With only 4 hours and 45 minutes left of viability, they realize they cannot go because the clouds are rolling in too quickly, and they could take a while to roll out. Dr. Claire opts for another ride and settles for a police escort to get the liver across town to the hospital. Dr. Andrews requests to see his patient alone and finds out Wanamaker hasn't quit smoking, but complains that he can't enjoy a drink of scotch with a massive hole in his mouth. Andrews explains he will graft from his leg to form a new cheek, but admits it won't be cheap, while Dr. Sean and Dr. Claire are still at the hospital with 4 hours and 14 minutes remaining. Dr. Sean tells Dr. Claire to tell Aaron that he might be late for their lunch together. When she hangs up, she makes small talk about his knowledge of the weather, but he can barely talk about it when the police escort pulls up. He stalls at the flashers and remembers a night when he was placed in a police vehicle, hitting the barrier, saying, "He promised me." Dr. Claire asks the police to turn off the lights, and Dr. Sean recovers, carrying the liver. He wants to know the donor's name, and Dr. Claire says it's Oliver. Dr. Neil comes to Andrew's office, who offers to make time to help with the free flap, but Andrew says he is the chief of surgery. He says he's more concerned about making the hospital the first on the list. Andrews claims to be aware of the stakes, but refuses his help. Dr. Kalu returns to the pathology lab and says there isn't alcohol in Chuck's system. Dr. Carly disagrees and says blood doesn't lie. Dr. Claire and Dr. Sean are 17 minutes out when Dr. Sean looks at the x-rays. He tells Dr. Claire he has a girl neighbor, nothing more. Suddenly, the temperature increases, and Dr. Claire says they must find ice. Meanwhile, Dr. Kalu comes to see Chuck, who admits to having a glass of champagne 3 days ago at his daughter's graduation party. Dr. Claire and Dr. Sean find a store, but their ice machine is broken. So she begins to pack frozen vegetables as Dr. Sean is fascinated by the slushy machine. He remembers when the police intended to use him for child services. He turns to Dr. Claire, saying the frozen vegetables won't work, but blocks her out again. Dr. Kalu and Dr. Neil talk about Chuck and the champagne he drank. Dr. Sean tells Dr. Claire the liver has to be submerged to cool, so they fill the cooler with the slushy, but he doesn't answer any of her questions. She realizes he doesn't like questions, and both smile as the temperature begins to drop. Dr. Neil and Dr. Kalu realize Chuck was telling the truth and they can still work on getting the transplant. Andrews throws out his lunch and sits with Dr. Aaron asking for advice, who realizes that Andrews is upset that he is no longer the young star in the hospital. Instead, Dr. Neil is. Aaron asks if he is the chief of a top surgeon or a leader who wants to be president and advises that he has to take out his ego and act presidential for the latter. He walks away, biting into Aaron's apple. Chuck wants to know if he deserves the liver. He admits he hasn't led a great life, and he could have been a more remarkable man and dad. He admits to drinking too much and has an older son he hasn't seen in over 3 years. He sees the people waiting, knows their faces and names, knows they have stories, but still he broke the rules. He can't continue talking as he codes. Dr. Kalu checks Chuck and discovers he has blood in his esophagus. Dr. Neil comes in and together they bring his pressure up. In the locker room, Dr. Neil says he has 3 months to live at best. Dr. Claire jokes that she needs a police escort every day to work due to traffic. Dr. Sean grabs the X-ray as he remembers when he saw a photo of a liver while Dr. Aaron came to see him as a child before Child Services took him. Dr. Sean begins to feel the liver. Dr. Claire says she doesn't know what he's looking for. The scan shows no clot, but Dr. Sean can feel it. Dr. Claire confirms it must have happened before they stored it, and they tell the police they need to stop performing surgery. Dr. Sean and Dr. Claire perform surgery on the liver to remove the clot on the highway. Dr. Andrews talks to his wealthy patient, assuring him he'll be just fine. Dr. Neil talks to Chuck and his family about the progress of his liver failure. He says he has 2 to 3 months and realizes that Chuck didn't tell his family about alcohol, but he assures them that he'll do everything he can to convince the committee. His daughter runs after Dr. Neil, saying she gave her father the drink, and if he doesn't get the liver, she is the one who killed him. Dr. Neil tries to convince the committee about giving him the liver, but Andrews is against it, claiming that there are rules and the registry may not approve another case when the need arises. Dr. Claire and Dr. Sean arrive at the hospital, and Dr. Claire is told that another hospital is coming to pick up the liver. An ambulance pulls up and she hands over the cooler, after which Dr. Sean randomly mentions that the donor's name was Oliver. The ambulance drives off. Dr. Sean says it was a good day, that they saved a life, just not Chuck's. Meanwhile, Andrews is undergoing Wanamaker's surgery but sends Mendelez to assist him. Chuck is all dressed with his family, ready to leave when his daughter walks up to Mendez. He assures her that it's not her fault, and she says she wants to believe that. She leaves, and he smiles at Chuck before he goes too. He stands with Andrews, who stares at the rich man trying to smoke after leaving the theater. They both leave. Dr. Sean gets home and stops at the neighbor's door, asking for his batteries. He calls them and asks for her name, and also tells her his. He goes into his house and drops food for his cat before sitting at the dining table. He had flashbacks with Dr. Aaron when they wanted to have dinner before Dr. Sean took him for Child Services. The following day, he goes for lunch with Aaron. Dr. Sean is lying on his bed, struggling while listening to the water dripping from the faucet. He frantically begins to search everywhere in the house and calls Dr. Aaron over in the middle of the night, saying they will have to find it. Dr. Sean shows him the list he made, and the star screwdriver is on it. Aaron tells him there's a hardware store up the street, but Dr. Sean wants his own, so he panics and Aaron yells at him but soon apologizes. Aaron finds the screwdriver and tells Dr. Sean that he's overwhelmed and stressed. He advises making a list of things the superintendent should fix and tells him to go to bed. At the hospital, Dr. Neil shares with Dr. Kalu and Dr. Claire the case of a woman who is 26 weeks pregnant after 3 miscarriages. Dr. Sean runs in, saying she needs an ultrasound and an MRI to measure the tumor's growth rate. Dr. Neil questions Dr. Sean's tired countenance after having 12 hours off. Dr. Claire defends him, which ticks Dr. Neil off. During the ultrasound, they discover the tumor is half the size of the fetus, so Dr. Neil informs the parents that it'll be safer to terminate the pregnancy. The parents will do all it takes to save the baby and ask about fetal surgery. He tells her the health and fetal risks because of her condition. The mother isn't bothered about the consequences as long as the child survives. The husband insists they could try again for a baby instead, but Dr. Sean says they can use other medications to save the mother. Out of the room, Dr. Neil orders Dr. Sean never to contradict him in front of a patient again. Dr. Sean says they're not in front of the patient now. Dr. Claire suggests the same thing, so Dr. Neil tells them to get her prepared. Andrews is covering the ER for Dr. Audrey Lim and needs someone to lance a boil. He sends down Dr. Claire and Dr. Sean, but Dr. Claire protests that their idea convinced him about the surgery, and he is punishing them for that. Dr. Neil says he's only punishing Dr. Sean for being late, and she needs to go with him because she defended him and seems to know how to communicate with him. When they get to the ER, they realize her boil is on her labia, and Dr. Claire takes a look. The patient is experiencing unusual pain from a boil, and Dr. Sean suggests she could have flesh-eating bacteria. Dr. Neil speaks to Andrews about the surgery on his pregnant patient, and after questioning if his judgment is clouded, Andrew agrees. Dr. Claire examines Olivia and explains that the abscess is probably from an untreated chlamydia infection. Dr. Sean visualizes everything as she shrieks in pain. Dr. Sean offers to try. Dr. Claire tells her there's nothing to be embarrassed about, as Dr. Sean says 25% of college students contract STDs before graduation. She reveals she gets tested for STDs every 30 days because she does porn. Dr. Neil talks to his whole team about how vitally important the surgery is, but is interrupted when Jessica calls him out to speak. He meets with the father, who says he doesn't want to. Dr. Neil tells him that he doesn't have a veto over his wife's medical condition. Jessica informs Dr. Neil that a husband cannot stop him from operating on his wife, but he can stop him from working on his baby. Dr. Kalu and Dr. Claire talk about the patient's role in porn, when Dr. Sean pipes in, shocking Dr. Kalu that he watches porn. Dr. Neil tells Dr. Sean to go home and get some rest, also telling Dr. Kalu to go home too, since Dr. Neil put the fetal surgery on hold. The board meets to discuss their options and realize if they do nothing, the fetus and the mother will die, and if they perform the legally complicated surgery, they could both live. Dr. Neil returns and shares the news with the parents. Barb tells her husband Mark if he loves her, he will support her. Dr. Neil tells them to get some sleep for the surgery in the morning. Dr. Claire talks to Dr. Kalu in bed, saying it's hard to believe her patient does porn because she doesn't seem like the type. She tells him about working in a youth shelter, and all the sex workers have a certain vibe. He thinks it's a huge deal that she shared some personal stuff with him. She kisses him to shut him up. Jessica and Dr. Neil talk about the pregnant patient. She wonders why she wants to go through that process. The patient thinks it's selfish to put her husband through so much to have a specific experience when she could have it other ways. This conversation makes Dr. Neil wonder if she wants to have kids naturally with him. He's trying to be serious, but she says when they're in a meeting, he is never to call her ideas ridiculous. On the bus, Dr. Sean notices all the stickers of women dressed in lingerie and remembers when he found his brother looking at a Peepers magazine. Dr. Sean stands up and tells the driver that he missed his stop. The driver lets him off. Dr. Sean unwraps the plastic scalpel his brother gave him as he stands confused at the roadside. Lee notices Dr. Sean and drives them home. She talks about the gym, and Dr. Sean bluntly tells her she stinks. She says it's nice how he says what's on his mind and says goodnight to him. Dr. Sean bangs on apartment 23, and the super is furious for waking him up in the middle of the night, but takes the list. The following morning, Aaron and Dr. Sean are having breakfast, and Aaron says it's his fault for Dr. Sean taking what he said literally. Aaron retracts and says Dr. Sean is brilliant and needs to navigate how things go. He mentions a personal support worker, but Dr. Sean is pissed and yells he doesn't need aid. They quietly eat their breakfast. Mark talks to Dr. Neil and he says he doesn't know why Dr. Neil is desperate for the surgery, but Dr. Neil says he isn't hopeless but confident, which should make him feel better. Andrews praises Dr. Sean for his pelvis exam work and realizes he doesn't like being squeezed. He asks if Dr. Sean has ever had a girlfriend. Dr. Sean is curious if he's encouraging or mocking him. Andrews says he wants to know the right time for either, and Dr. Sean wants to know when it's a good time to mock him. They see the swelling isn't going down and realize there's a fibroid tumor wrapped around the nerve. They have to remove the cancer, but that means it will sever all feeling in her genitals. Dr. Neil begins the surgery. Just as he cuts into the uterus, her heart drops. He stops and informs the mother that she formed a blood clot in her heart, and they don't have any option but to terminate the pregnancy because the clots could affect her heart. The board meets again, and they want him to do the surgery again. Dr. Kalu interrupts with an idea. Dr. Neil and Dr. Kalu explain that they can stop her heart. It doesn't eliminate every risk, but it does reduce the biggest one. Dr. Sean returns home and knocks on the superintendent's door late at night and tells him he fixed the sink, but he wasn't supposed to touch it because it wasn't on the list. The superintendent tells him if he doesn't like it, to move and not knock on his door after 5 p.m. Dr. Neil and Dr. Kalu both work overnight on a plan for the surgery, as Dr. Sean, who also cannot sleep, visualizes the pipes in his apartment. In the morning, Dr. Claire and Andrews come to see their patient for her surgery. Dr. Sean comes rushing in, suggesting how to avoid all that. They do the surgery and congratulate both Dr. Sean and Dr. Claire for their excellent work. Olivia asks Dr. Claire to call her parents. Andrew says although Dr. Neil doesn't say it enough, they're both doing a great job, and they can always meet him if they need to talk. Meanwhile, Dr. Kalu and Mendelez successfully flush her heart. They perform her C-section. Dr. Kalu is mesmerized by the tiny fetus. Dr. Neil removes the tumor and puts the baby back. Dr. Neil ruins the surprise and calls the baby a boy as the parents smile. After the day is done, Dr. Kalu and Dr. Claire go out drinking and insist on bringing Dr. Sean. At the club, he has a flashback to when he was a boy and Colleen came to see him, acting friendly but making it a cruel joke. Back at the bar, he cheers both Dr. Kalu and Dr. Claire for the great day. If you want to watch the rest of this serial, please go to Lion Recaps channel. You'll find other episodes and serials there too. That was all from the video. I hope you liked it. Subscribe for more content like this and hit the like button to help us out. Also, leave a comment if you want us to recap your favorite movie. See you later and take care.